November 14th, 1990. Zurich, Switzerland. 46 dead. An Alitalia DC-9 into a mountainside in the dark. The glide slope said centered. The localizer said on course. The autopilot said descending normally. All of it was a phantom, a known fault, a 15-year-old warning that never reached the cockpit. And when the first officer tried to go around, 4 words from the captain sealed their fate. No, 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 catch the glide. To understand how an aircraft could fly a perfect approach into the side of a mountain, you have to go back to earlier that same day, to Milan Linate Airport in northern Italy. It was a cloudy early afternoon when Captain Raffaele Liberti and his first officer, Massimo Di Fraia, stepped out of a taxi and walked into the terminal. They had flown together the previous day, so they were familiar with each other. The plan for the evening was 4 short legs: Milan to Frankfurt, back to Milan, then Milan to Zurich and back. A standard day if everything went according to plan. Liberti was 47 years old, a former military pilot who had joined Alitalia and worked his way through the DC-8, DC-9, and Boeing 727 before earning his command on the DC-9. His logbook showed just over 10,000 hours, but only 1,200 as captain. Di Fraia was 28, with a total of 831 hours, fresh from Alitalia's own flight academy. He was competent, but green. The gap between the two men, in rank, in hours, in background, was enormous. And the captain's former military bearing made it wider. When they entered the cockpit, the captain opened the technical log and found 2 remarks from the previous crew. The first described a failure in one of the navigation receivers, no to from indication on the instruments. The second was more unsettling. During a simulated approach, the autopilot had dived below the glide path and then overcorrected with what the previous crew called an accentuated dive. They had disconnected and landed manually. The engineers at Linate had swapped the 2 nav receivers around and downgraded the aircraft to Category 1 approaches only. The airplane was cleared to fly, but the technical history of these navigation radios was already telling a story that no one was reading carefully enough. The first 2 legs, Milan to Frankfurt and back, went normally, except that during the return, the same nav problems appeared again, this time on the opposite receiver. The swap had fixed nothing. Back at Linate, the engineers replaced both receivers entirely. They installed a King KNR 6030 in the NAV1 slot and a Collins 51R V2 Bravo in NAV2. They tested both units against the Linate VOR and localizer. Everything passed. But they could not test glide slope reception from the aircraft's parking stand. And both new receivers belonged to types without proper failure monitoring on their glide slope output. This meant that if a receiver's glide slope signal failed internally, the instruments would not display a warning flag. Nobody flagged this to the crew. The engineers wrote a note in the tech log, asking the pilots to fly an automatic approach at Zurich to restore the aircraft's Category 3 status for the return leg, where fog was expected at Linate. This mattered. Without Cat 3 clearance, they might not be able to land back in Milan later that night. The pilots acknowledged the note and moved on with their setup. The first officer would be pilot flying for the Zurich leg. The captain would handle radios and monitoring. It was a standard division of labor that placed the less experienced pilot on the controls and the more experienced one in the oversight role, exactly where the captain's vigilance should have been most valuable. 40 passengers boarded for the evening departure. Business people, families, travelers connecting through Zurich. Among them was Roberto Mariano, an Italian actor leaving for work in Switzerland. They settled into the cabin of the 16-year-old DC-9. Registration, India Alpha Tango Juliet Alpha. Overhead bins closed, seatbelts fastened. The cabin crew completed their count. At 6:36 in the evening, Alitalia Flight 404 took off from runway 36 right, with 46 souls on board, and turned north toward the Alps and the darkness. In front of the captain sat a pair of instruments that would soon matter more than anything else in the cockpit. The altimeter was a drum pointer type, a clock face dial showing hundreds of feet, with a small rotating drum behind a tiny window showing thousands. Reading it required 2 separate steps. Check the dial for hundreds, then check the drum for thousands. Because the drum was so small and sat behind a narrow aperture, these altimeters had already been documented as dangerously prone to misreading. A pilot, glancing quickly, could see 300 on the dial and misread the drum as 1,000 instead of 0. 1,300 feet instead of 300. The difference between a minor correction and a fatal mistake. That detail is worth remembering. To understand why those replacement nav receivers were so dangerous, you need to know how a glide slope indicator works on an aircraft like the DC-9. The instrument shows the pilot whether the aircraft is above, below, or on the correct descent path toward the runway. It gets this information from a nav receiver, which picks up radio signals from a transmitter near the runway threshold. When everything works, the system is elegant and reliable. But when the receiver fails in one very specific way, it becomes a trap. If a short circuit or signal break occurs between the receiver output and the instrument receives a null signal. And on certain older receivers without proper output monitoring, a null signal produced exactly the same cockpit indication as a perfectly centered glide slope. No failure flag appeared, no warning activated. The needle just sat dead center, telling the crew they were on a perfect path, when in reality, there was no signal at all. A phantom. This problem had been identified back in 1975. The affected receiver types, including the Collins 51 RV2 Bravo, now sitting in the NAV2 slot of Flight 404, were supposed to be upgraded to a newer variant with proper monitoring. Not all operators followed through. In 1984, Douglas sent an all-operator letter specifically warning about the possibility of frozen glide slope and localizer indications. But because they assumed the older Collins units had already been upgraded per the 1975 advisory, they excluded those receivers from the affected group. Then, in 1985, a seminar in the United States further highlighted the danger. Alitalia pilots had attended that seminar. But somehow, the information never made it down to the line pilots who actually flew these aircraft every day. 15 years of warnings existed in the system. Not one of them reached the cockpit of Flight 404. Back in the cabin, the passengers watched the last November daylight disappear as the DC-9 climbed to flight level 200, just high enough to clear the Alpine peaks on this short hop to Zurich. The flight would last barely 40 minutes. Some passengers were already thinking about their connections on the other side. The cabin crew moved through the narrow aisle with their service cart, a routine Wednesday evening above the mountains. Up front, the captain tuned the Zurich weather frequency. Surface wind from the southwest at 8 knots, visibility 10 kilometers in mist, a few clouds at 1,500 feet, broken layers at 3,000 and 4,000. Reasonable conditions for a night approach. Runway 14 was in use with the ILS. But instead of focusing the briefing on the approach they were about to fly, the captain spent several minutes discussing a potential circling maneuver to runway 28, a complicated procedure that was unlikely to be needed given the actual wind direction. This consumed time that would have been better spent reviewing the specific altitude cross-checks for the ILS to runway 14. And when the first officer began his portion of the briefing, the captain caught him reading from the wrong approach chart. De Frya had the plate for runway 16 instead of runway 14. The captain corrected him, but in a tone that belonged in a classroom rather than a cockpit on a line flight. Instructional, almost parental. This was not training. But the first officer accepted the correction without pushback, and the dynamic was set. Throughout the cockpit voice recording, this pattern repeated. The captain lectured, the first officer absorbed. There was almost none of the collaborative cross-checking that crew resource management training was designed to produce. The first officer suggested flying a practice Category 2 approach, as the engineers had requested for the nav system check. The captain agreed, but there was barely any discussion about the extra procedures a Cat 2 approach would require, the tighter altitude callouts, the lower decision height, the specific cross-checks that could catch exactly the kind of instrument failure now hiding inside their panel. The captain did make one important call-out during the descent. The outer marker crossing altitude should be 1,250 feet at 3.8 miles. This was correct, and it would be the last reliable checkpoint between them and the mountain. If you're enjoying this video, please take a moment to subscribe and hit that notification bell. It helps us bring you more stories like this one. Zurich approach cleared them to descend to 4,000 feet and gave them radar vectors for the ILS runway 14. According to the published procedure, 4,000 feet was to be maintained until 8 nautical miles from the runway. the point where the real glide slope should be intercepted and descent should begin. The captain had nav-1 tuned to the ILS with the inbound course of 138 degrees. The first officer had nav-2 tuned to the Cloten VOR for the potential missed approach. The nav switching unit was set to approach mode, meaning each pilot's instruments received signals independently from their own nav receiver, with a comparator standing by to flag any discrepancy between the two sides. As they were vectored from the northeast, the captain remarked that they were being kept high, passing abeam the airport at flight level 90. He had no information about how many track miles of vectors to expect, so he could not actually know this. But the perception lodged in his mind, and it would color everything he interpreted from this point on. And then something failed inside nav receiver 1. The exact cause was never conclusively determined, most likely a short circuit or internal signal break. The glide slope output went to null. Because this was one of those non-monitored receivers, the captain's glide slope indicator did not display a failure flag. Instead, the needle settled dead center, on glide. The Phantom had arrived. The localizer, the left-right guidance, was still working correctly on both sides. So when the autopilot captured the center line and began tracking toward runway 14, everything looked normal on the lateral axis. But on the captain's side, the glide slope showed captured at 12 nautical miles, far beyond the 8 miles where the real intercept should occur. Meanwhile, the first officer's instruments, correctly fed by nav-2, showed no glide slope at all. His needle was parked at the top of the display, out of view, exactly where it should have been at that distance. The comparator did its job. It detected the mismatch and lit the warning. The first officer noticed and asked if the captain had the glide. The captain said yes, on his side, nav-1. 5 seconds later, the first officer reported that he did not have it on his side. This was the moment where everything could have been saved. A pause, a hold, a methodical comparison of both sides against the DME distance would have shown that glide slope capture at 12 miles was physically impossible. The approach could have continued safely using the first officer's working instruments, or they could have asked for new vectors and a fresh approach, but that didn't happen. The captain told the first officer to switch the nav unit from approach mode to radio 1. This commanded all 4 cockpit navigation instruments to take their signals exclusively from the faulty nav-1 receiver. The first officer complied without challenge. The Phantom spread to both sides of the cockpit. The comparator warning vanished, because both sides now showed the same lie. Localizer tracking, glide slope centered, everything normal. The last electronic barrier that had correctly identified the problem was silenced, and no one stopped to ask why 2 independent systems had disagreed just seconds earlier. Back in the cabin, the passengers had no sense of anything unusual. The DC-9 was descending smoothly through the darkness. The seatbelt sign illuminated, the cabin crew seated for arrival. Through the small windows, there was nothing to see, just the blackness of a November night over the Swiss lowlands. The approach felt like every other approach. It was not. The autopilot descended the aircraft at 700 feet per minute, a normal rate for a standard ILS approach. But they were not on a standard ILS. They were 1,200 feet below the real glide slope, sinking through dark terrain northwest of Zurich. The captain had already decided they were being kept high. The early descent confirmed his assumption. Confirmation bias locked in, a psychological trap where the brain prioritizes information that matches its existing belief and discounts everything that contradicts it. The correctly tracking localizer reinforced the illusion. If the left-right guidance was working perfectly, surely the up-down guidance must be right too. Every indication that matched the Phantom was accepted. Everything that contradicted it was dismissed or explained away. Ahead of them, invisible in the November darkness, sat the Stadlerberg, a 2,090-foot mountain about 5 nautical miles from runway 14. It had no obstruction lights. It did not appear on the simplified approach charts that Alitalia used, which had removed terrain features from the profile view. Under a normal glide slope, aircraft cleared it easily. 1,200 feet below that slope, it became a wall. And because the DC-9 was flying so far below the correct path, the mountain now blocked the runway and approach lights that should have been visible ahead. Where the crew should have seen a lit runway growing in the windscreen, there was only darkness, the black hole effect, an invisible obstacle with every instrument in the cockpit confirming the path was safe. The ground proximity warning system could not help. The aircraft's GPWS was an older model that relied on closure rates rather than a terrain database. With the gear down and flaps set for landing, it would only trigger on excessive descent rates, rapid terrain closure from below, or deviation from the glide slope. The descent rate was a normal 700 feet per minute. The terrain was ahead, not below. And the glide slope mode was connected to the ILS instrument, which was showing on glide. Every electronic safeguard had been bypassed. The only barrier left was the crew themselves, and the mountain was now less than 2 minutes ahead. The aircraft descends through the area where the outer marker cross-check should have matched, 1,250 feet at 3.8 miles. They are already far below that altitude and still outside the marker position. The captain notes the distance. The first officer asks twice if they have passed the outer marker. The captain says no. Both men can feel something is wrong. The numbers are not reconciling. At 6.25 nautical miles from the runway, the captain says it aloud. That doesn't make sense to me. The first officer replies immediately, nor to me. 2 seconds of silence. The last window. The captain calls out, pull. The autopilot disconnects. But this is not a go-around. The captain has looked down at his drum pointer altimeter. The clock face dial reads 300 feet. But the tiny drum window, he misreads it. 1,000 instead of 0, 1,300 feet, just a little low. A pull-up to level off, re-intercept the phantom glide, and continue. If he had glanced at the radio altimeter, mounted just inches away, he would have seen 350 feet, the true height above the ground rising toward them. He does not look. 2 seconds after the captain's call, the first officer does what his training demands. Go around. He pushes the thrust levers forward. He pitches the nose up to 5.4 degrees. The engines spool. The descent rate drops from over 1,000 feet per minute to 190. The aircraft begins to climb. Later analysis will confirm. If this go-around is allowed to continue for 11 more seconds, the DC-9 clears the Stadlerberg with altitude to spare. The captain overrides. No, 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 no. Catch the glide. 10,000 hours speaking to 831. The same voice that has been correcting and instructing all evening. The wrong chart, the wrong approach plate, the speed, the procedures. That voice has not been challenged once tonight. It is not challenged now. De Frya complies. He eases the pitch back. The thrust comes down. The climb rate collapses. The aircraft levels, then begins a shallow descent again. The mountain rises ahead of them, invisible, closing the distance that was their only margin. Can you hold it? The captain asks. Yes, the first officer answers. 1 second later, the radio altimeter warning sounds, 200 feet above ground. The trees of the Stadlerberg are directly ahead and below, closing fast. The captain begins to speak. Hold on, let's try to... At 7:11 and 19 seconds in the evening, the right wing of the DC-9 strikes the trees on the northern slope of the Stadlerberg at an altitude of 1,660 feet above sea level. The aircraft rolls violently to the right and begins to invert. The right engine tears from the fuselage. The tail section disintegrates. The cabin breaks apart as the fuselage plows into the wooded hillside. Fuel from the ruptured wings ignites on impact. The fire spreads through the forest and burns until the following evening. All 46 people on board, 40 passengers and 6 crew, are killed. There are no survivors. The wreckage lies scattered across the wooded northern slope of the Stadlerberg, 5.2 nautical miles from the runway they were supposed to reach. The impact crater and debris field stretch through the trees. The fire burns through the night and into the next day before crews can fully contain it. The approach controller watches Flight 404 disappear from his radar screen. He calls the tower frequency the crew had been told to contact. No reply. He calls again. Nothing. Minutes later, he asks the next inbound aircraft if they have traffic in sight ahead. The response comes back. There is a fire on the ground, but there is no traffic in sight. Zurich Airport closes immediately. All inbound traffic is redirected. Rescue crews make their way to the forested hillside in the dark. The wreckage is scattered across the slope, still burning. The fire will not be fully contained until the following evening. There is nothing to save. In Italy, families waiting for news from the Zurich arrival board will wait for hours before the truth reaches them. A memorial will eventually be placed on the Stadlerberg at the site where the DC-9 came to rest. The Swiss Federal Aircraft Accidents Inquiry Board led the investigation with more than 80 investigators, supported by Italian authorities, the NTSB, and the FAA. Both the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder were recovered from the wreckage. One of the first things investigators established was that the weather was not the primary problem. Other aircraft that landed on runway 14 that same evening reported having the approach and runway lighting in sight throughout their final descent. The ILS transmitter on the ground was working correctly. The problem was entirely inside the aircraft. Examination of the NAV-1 receiver under a microscope confirmed the phantom. At the moment of impact, the glide slope indicator was positioned just above center, still showing on glide. The localizer was tracking correctly. The autopilot had performed exactly as commanded. The DC-9 had followed a phantom signal into the side of a mountain, while every instrument in the cockpit agreed with the lie. Investigators traced the failure through 15 years of missed warnings. The Collins 51 RV-2 Bravo, installed in NAV-1, was one of the units flagged in the 1975 advisory as needing a monitoring upgrade. That upgrade was never performed on this unit. The 1984 Douglas All-Operator Letter excluded it from the affected group, assuming the earlier fix had been applied. The 1985 U.S. seminar reached Alitalia representatives, but the information never filtered down to the line pilots who needed it. 3 separate chances to catch this failure before it ever reached an aircraft on approach. All 3 missed. The investigation also examined the Stadlerberg. The mountain had been discussed as a hazard since 1976 between Swissair, Swiss airport authorities, and the Federal Office of Civil Aviation. No obstruction lights were ever installed because it sat beyond the 5.5-kilometer threshold required by international standards. Runway 14 had no precision approach path indicator, the red and white visual system that would have shown the crew they were catastrophically low. And Zurich had no minimum safe altitude warning system, the radar-based alert already standard at most major U.S. airports by 1990, that would have flagged the controller the moment the aircraft descended below a safe altitude. Multiple ground-based safety barriers that could have interrupted this chain simply did not exist at Zurich in November 1990. The board's most devastating finding was also the simplest. If the first officer's go-around had been allowed to continue for 11 seconds, every person on that aircraft would have survived. The captain's override, driven by his misreading of the drum altimeter and his belief that they were only slightly low, was the direct cause of impact. The authority gradient that ran through the entire CVR recording made it virtually impossible for the first officer to challenge that override in the moment it mattered most. The investigation produced recommendations that reshaped commercial aviation. NAV equipment without proper failure monitoring of its output signal was banned. If a receiver could fail silently, showing centered when it had no signal, it could no longer be installed in a commercial aircraft. Drum pointer altimeters, already documented as prone to dangerous misreading, were ordered removed from service with immediate effect. Swiss authorities installed obstruction lighting on the Stadlerberg, a minimum safe altitude warning system at Zurich, and precision approach path indicator lights on runway 14. McDonnell Douglas revised its training documentation to specifically include the phantom glide slope failure mode. And Alitalia issued a directive that swept through the entire industry and remains a bedrock rule of commercial aviation today. If any pilot initiates a go-around when the aircraft's position is in doubt, that go-around must be flown to completion. No questions asked, no overrides, no exceptions. Not by the captain, not by anyone. Before Flight 404, it was accepted in many cockpits that the captain had the authority to cancel a go-around initiated by the first officer. After Flight 404, that authority was gone. The rule is simple: any pilot, any seat, any time. Once a go-around is called, you go around, full stop. This single change has saved more lives than anyone will ever be able to count. The next time a first officer calls go-around and a captain hesitates, 46 people on a forested hillside near Zurich are the reason the answer is always the same. You fly the go-around, every single time. Captain Liberty had 10,000 hours and a voice that filled the cockpit. First Officer De Fraya had 831 hours and the right answer. In the 3 seconds between go around and no, 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 catch the glide, the aircraft crossed from survival to disaster. The instruments said on course. The mountains said otherwise. And the one person who saw the truth, who felt the wrongness in the numbers before he could name it, who reached for the throttles and pulled back on the column the way he had been trained, was told to stop. He stopped. And 46 people never came home from a Wednesday evening flight that was supposed to last 40 minutes. If you found this video valuable, please like and subscribe. Sharing these stories is how we make sure the lessons aren't forgotten. And if you want to see what happens when a pilot enters clouds with only 7 hours of real instrument experience, that story is right here.